Wednesday Forever. The iconic comic books that inspired a generation, told by the creators that made them. Created and hosted by Michael Dolce and Victor Dandridge. Join the movement. Go Rogue. RogueMatter.com. Welcome to Wednesday Forever, a look back on the iconic comic books that inspired a generation. We'd like to bring creators involved in those issues to talk about us, to give us the real behind-the-scenes look at the work in question, the process of creation, the story of how it got made. This is Wednesday Forever. Today's installment is Witchblade #1 with co-creator David Wohl, editor Renae Geerlings, and I'm your host, Michael Dolce, as always joined by my co-host extraordinaire, Mr. Victor Dandridge. Victor, how you doing, sir?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I am doing Wednesday Forever.
Yeah, you are.
That's as good as it gets.
On a Tuesday,
talking about all the good stuff going on.
That's right.
Renae and David, how are you guys doing?
Doing great.
Doing all right. Thank you.
Excellent.
I love it. So we got it going on here. So Witchblade #1. Obviously, I think we should start with when we were even just talking, off air a minute ago. It's so synonymous with Michael Turner, because if I think Michael Turner, I think two things. I think Witchblade and I think Fathom. And those are the two things that, obviously, right. I know he created Soulfire. I know he did Superman God, he did the DC run and the Identity Crisis covers. And he was a prolific cover artist later on. But in terms of sequential stuff, in terms of storytelling, it's Michael Turner. David, you are one of the co-creators of Witchblade. Can you take us back to that initial, how did you get paired with Michael on the book? Brian Haberlin also is the co-creator of the book. Give us the story of the genesis of this.
Well, basically, it was an interesting time at Top Cow, because I started at Top Cow in like '93 when there were basically 4 issues of Cyberforce out. Maybe Mark was working on the 4th one. I was working at Marvel before that, and I came into this deal where we had one book, which was really theoretically supposed to be one book a month, but it was really one book every 4 months.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of free
You
time.
were working at Image, so I mean that was
right.
That was. I
No
think
one's
that's one of those things. It's like, can you put out a monthly book? You don't belong here. You're out. You're out. You're not one of the partners.
So we had a lot of time, and Mark Silvestri, really wanted to do more books than just Cyberforce. So we'd spend a lot of time, like he and I would just sit at his pool. When we lived in San Diego, we would just sit in his backyard at his pool and like try to come up with ideas. It was like the most fun, like from where I was at Marvel to where I came there. Even like since then, I've never experienced anything like that, because we really had no schedule. It was just sitting there and trying to come up with stuff. The first thing we came up with was actually The Darkness. Actually, it's not true. We came up with Weapon Zero pretty early on there, but then The Darkness too. We came up with a very like simple idea for it, and then Mark wanted to do something with like a female lead, and we had this other guy, Brian Haberlin, who was there. Who was basically the guy. He was the founder of our coloring department. So
right. That's the funny part, that he gets the co-creator now, because that's. I mean, immediately I was like, oh, he was a colorist, because he was great. I mean, he did some of the most epic. Like trading card colors and things like that, back in the day.
He trained everybody in our studio.
Yeah.
They were all painters. It was his idea to start bringing in painters and train them in Photoshop so they could do that work. So
That's awesome.
He did an amazing job. But he was also a creator. And by then we had moved to Santa Monica. It was 1 year later. And Brian and I would just like go to lunch together and try to come up with new stuff the same way Mark and I used to. But we do it at we were on the pier in Santa Monica. And Brian and I both had a love of like Stormbringer, like Elric, like Michael Moorcock writing, and really wanted to do this like eternal champion kind of story, but in the modern day with a woman. And so we started coming up with the idea for it. So a lot of the very basic stuff and the characters, like we came up with over a few weeks, and then pitched it to Mark. And then Mark's like, let's call it the Witchblade, which I didn't like, but I ended up liking it eventually. It grew on because he did come up with good ideas. And then he helped us develop it from that point, it grew out with the 3 of us. And then at the same time, Michael Turner was doing, like, he was like this hot up and coming artist that we had found at San Diego, like maybe less than a year earlier, like 9 months earlier. Maybe over a year, but he basically sent us submissions. Mark was like, well, this guy's okay. He draws like really good backgrounds. Like we learned that he had this photographic memory. He couldn't really draw people too well. And Mark was like, okay, maybe we'll bring him in and he could do backgrounds for us. And we didn't realize he's like the most competitive guy alive, and completely learned from. We were in the studio setting with all these artists who were there like 24 hours a day, and he just got better. Like he just worked so hard. He just got better and better and better. So we put him on this book, Ballistic, that actually Brian Haberlin was writing. And then by the time he was in the 3rd issue of this 3-issue book, we were like, oh, we want to put him on this new book we're doing, Witchblade. And the schedule was already like terrible. Like it was basically, I think it was September, and the book was supposed to come out in November, and we're like, okay, start. And I was a really slow writer. Lord knows what was going on with me, but everything was late. And then Christina Z, who ended up being my co-writer, I met her on AOL, and
that's a
for all you
throwback
kids out
statement
there,
right there.
AOL was a thing back then.
that was
Hey, I still use AOL. Don't diss it.
You still do. You still got your AOL.
That's right.
They do? I got to check it out.
I do.
And she just had really cool ideas. And so the two of us, like I had already written the 1st issue with Brian, but then I brought her in to help me with the dialogue.
Yeah.
And then from then on, we just kept working together because she had different strengths than I did. And she actually pushed me to be better. And it was really cool. So it was a very cool little dynamic we had set up there at the beginning, but we didn't really know what we had, Yeah. I mean, Michael Turner was good, but we didn't know what a phenomenon he was going to become. And then I didn't mention this enough, but he really did a lot to do with like all the looks of all the characters. And then he quickly started getting involved in the story more too.
Yeah.
Like after we did the 1st issue, and he became so popular so fast that it was surprising to me because, I don't like to talk about this, but it really pissed me off at the beginning. And it was like so popular.
I mean, you understand that.
And I was really envious of him, because suddenly immediately retailers were calling and asking him to go to shows, and he and I went to the signing in Orlando like really early on. But then I grew up. I think that was the bottom line, is I needed to grow up. And then I got to watch like everyone else, as he became this like phenomenon. And even though he pissed me off sometimes when he would ask me to make changes in the story, and maybe I didn't agree with some of them, they were usually right because he actually was a really good creator, all around, and always knew what he was talking about. So eventually it was very fun to watch him rise. Well,
it was good because you were almost threw a chair through the screen when I was like Witchblade, Michael Turner.
You're like, what? No.
No, I checked myself out. I said that was it. I'm like, I'm done. I'm done. It's I'm just getting back from vacation. It's terrible. I have no brain. So
now, for me, Witchblade kind of like superseded Cyberforce to become the flagship title of Top Cow. At what point did you guys realize that that's what you were working on, was this new flagship piece?
I think it was pretty quick. Well, I mean, it was a weird timing in the industry because there was this bad girl thing going on,
right?
And then there was also a small time where we left Image. We were like on our own,
right?
And, there was all this other stuff going on. So when we launched Witchblade, it wasn't actually part of Image; it was part of its own thing. So it got a lot of heat, being around that. We were this independent company, like doing this new book. But yeah, it was really definitely by like the first couple of issues that we found that we suddenly had a newer audience that was beyond the Mark Silvestri audience. I mean, there's a reason why we call the book Mark Silvestri's Witchblade. It was because we felt like we needed Mark's heat to help the book go. And then suddenly it was like, oh, Michael Turner has his own heat, and it was an interesting time because like suddenly to have this artist that became on par with Mark Silvestri, and also like for us it was our first like image born artist, like prior to at the beginning, Top Cow, we were really just hiring Marvel artists, or maybe some DC artists, like Brandon Peterson, came from Marvel.
Right.
There were people already with their own, identity and stuff they worked on. But Michael Turner was the first artist of ours that really took off, and Dave Finch, obviously,
right.
around the time, who took off internally from us, and it was cool, because then suddenly we're part of like a movement,
Yeah. Renae, you have a funny story, and we'll circle back to the first issue a second or two of how you got into Top Cow to begin with.
Well, it's one of those things that being an editor in comic books is such a weird niche position, and people would always ask me, how did you do it? How did you get in? And Honestly, I was just so lucky. I got a temp job answering phones there are moments in your life that you remember, and for some reason you must have known in the moment that this was important, but it was such a small moment. I was 22 years old, sitting on the floor of my one-room apartment in Los Angeles, and my temp agency called me and said, we have a job for you to go 2 days and answer phones at a place called Top Cow. And I said, what do they do? And they said, I don't know, something with art.
I mean, ish.
And so I went down there and I answered phones for 2 days, and it was so awesome. I got to sit and answer phones and read comic books all day. And so I said, if anything happens again, I would love to go back and do that. And then I lucked out that the receptionist was going on vacation to Italy for 2 weeks. So I swooped in and made friends with everyone.
Smart.
And played a lot of Puzzle Fighter. Playing Puzzle Fighter was my key to my job. So that's really how I got in there. But then I actually ended up working for Brad Foxhoven, assisting the president for a while, and he had to leave for a weekend. So I said, does anybody else need help? Because as a temp, it's hard to find a fill-in for a couple days. And they sent me down to editorial. And this dark office at the end of the hall is very quiet. And they sent me in there, and I did a lot of alphabetization and
there you go.
Sending out, what was I doing, David? I was doing all the comps. I was sending out comp copies of free books to artists. I was doing art returns.
Yeah.
And fan mail. And then I think I organized your office for you. Which I would have fired me at that point. I would have been like, get out.
Well, it said piles of stuff, right? I think I had like piles of CDs and
Did.
walls of books. I like to surround myself with things.
Well, the funny thing is you say it's kind of like, lucky, and it is lucky in a sense that, yeah, you got the call to go there, but that's the story of, I can't even tell you, countless people in the industry. We had Fabian Niciez on the show, and, he started out in like advertising,
Right.
before he was even like, really writing or doing anything, in the forefront. So it's not as uncommon really. And so when people ask like, oh, how do you break in? And, one of the things you can tell them, if you're not Michael Turner and you can't be discovered, I mean, it's just to network and to be,
Yeah.
work within the industry you want to work in. It doesn't necessarily, have to be at this forefront. What was your take from being an outsider, coming into Top Cow and seeing, this world of comic books, and how familiar were you with this world when you first got in?
Right.
Seeing guys playing video games 24/7.
That much hasn't changed, right? Like that's
yeah.
20 years later.
Well, it was such a weird little bubble. And in some ways, like David said, I think we didn't have any idea what we were in. But yet there was this energy. There was this excitement. I mean, there was so much talent in that building. You kind of took it for granted, which was also part of the joy of it, was that you were just surrounded by these people who were just so talented that forget about it. But they were all having fun and playing video games. And, there was the little like fights or the whatever, but it was kind of like a dorm where everybody lived and ate and slept. And we were on the 3rd Street Promenade. So there was restaurants and movie theaters, and everybody's
Nice.
whole world was that studio. And it was just so exciting to be there.
Yeah. Take us back, David,
That sounds
to
creatively enriching.
It was.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Good. Yeah.
I know I've talked to several people since then who have said, man, if I could go back and just really appreciate what it was. I mean, I think I did on some level, but you also took it for granted because it just kind of happened.
Hindsight's always 20/20, so I totally understand that.
That's an interesting, observation too, though. I think the fact that even, because even though we're all still in the same industry, the industry's completely different. I mean,
Right.
I mean, obviously back then I wasn't in the industry yet. I didn't break in until, Wizard magazine was in 2000 is the first time I got, within the industry. Right. And that time at Wizard was one of the best times because, David, just as your description was.
I loved to go to Wizard.
Yeah.
We used to go there every year. It was like it was a fun trip.
I mean, it was just a group of guys, hanging out, a couple gals, and we'd all be just, hanging out and, just having, this amazing time. And you're in your like, early 20s and you're just out of college, or you're just just getting into the workforce. I mean, to have the experience you had, Renae, that must have felt like, well, this must be what life is, just period, right? Because that's what I thought. I was like, well, I'm always going to find a place like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
David, take us through the story of Witchblade. You guys said you kind of were just throwing ideas against the wall. How fully formed were these characters in your guys' heads when you put pen to paper and wrote the first issue?
By the time we wrote the first issue, it was pretty. We had spent maybe, like I said, we had so much time, So I think we developed it over like 6 months.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think because it was really early on. We moved to Santa Monica in like '94, and then it was so early on in the process when we first started developing it. I think it probably took about a year to get to a place where the first issue was done, just because we had. I mean, we were doing other things too, but we were really able to just incubate it. Like we would have these meetings in Mark's office to just come up with ideas for the villains and stuff.
Nice.
And then the other advantage to the studio environment was amazingly creative people like Joe Benitez suddenly would be the guy who really was involved in creation of the Witchblade armor and the Witchblade gauntlet, and it was just like this team effort. Everybody was doing everything. So that just led to like a fertile environment for new ideas. But yeah, it probably took about a year to come up with like the general outline for the first story arc and the characters and then able to just work on the actual scripts from there.
You kind of hinted at it before, but did you have like a missive that you were trying to hit? Obviously it was the bad girl era. Were there things that you were trying to, definitely tick mark off so that way your creation would be, that it would cover a number of demographics?
No, it was just a female lead. It was just seeing that there was an environment lacking. I mean, because we were at the early end of the bad girl thing too. So like we weren't trying to cash in on it or anything. We just felt like we had a whole bunch of male leads, and it would be great to have a female lead character. That was really all we were. I mean, if Brian and I, wanted to tick off something, it would have been, a sentient weapon, that has a mind of its own, and there were things like that, but nothing from like a marketing standpoint or from a niche. We wanted to occupy this niche when it came out. I think we had free reign to do that stuff. I mean, ultimately. Some choices were made, that were a little less free, but that was all like way on in the process, like when we're coming up with her name and stuff.
Gotcha.
Like we originally had her based on Jennifer Lopez, and
Smart.
changed our minds and went like a different way. So.
Oh man!
You could cast J-Lo right now.
Great.
She looks phenomenal.
Jennifer Lopez, Anaconda, maybe. Or
I just watched that, by the way. Let me just throw that out there.
You mentioned also too how it's part. At that time you guys were creating left and right, so you had like the darkness, and you had the different creative people in there as well too. At what point did you connect this into its own larger universe? You said you're working the first story outline for a year. Was that larger story, part of that initial, take on it, or was it kind of, kind of like, oh, by the way, it would be really great if we could connect the darkness with the Witchblade.
Just the darkness and the Witchblade. It was pretty early on that we decided we wanted to connect them both. Because by Witchblade 10, we had like the darkness start in there.
Mm-hmm.
So probably it definitely wasn't the original idea, because the version of the darkness that Mark and I came up with was very different than the version that Garth Ennis did, and darkness went in a whole different direction than we were intending it to.
Right.
I think that the direction that Garth
that tends to happen with Garth Ennis, doesn't it now?
Right.
Yeah, it was like the best thing in the world. I mean, what we wanted to do, I thought was cool. It was like a Tim Burton kind of thing, but what Garth did was, took it to the next level. And because Garth ended up putting it in the same place as us, it just allowed us to kind of combine them. So I would say there's probably some retroactive like fitting in there to make it work, but it was pretty early on that we decided to do it. And then once the two of them were there, I think I'm probably guilty of this. Like maybe I'm not so good with shared universes because I always want things to be independent, and I feel like if you have a shared universe, then how come people aren't always paying attention to this million things that are happening? So I probably could have done better to make it a shared universe at the beginning. But I think that since then they did a good job of doing it.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, scripting out how Witchblade #1, kind of drops, talk to us about how it was to put that final piece together, to say, we put all this time building this, let's go.
Well, I'm so like I said, I came from Marvel. So the Marvel that I came from, like, writers barely knew where their stories were going, and used to write just plots and then write the scripts later. Which Renae loved the fact that I used to do that, because there was nothing easier than getting the dialogue out of me. But
look at that smile. That's the greatest. Like, I love you so much.
But David, we also, because the artists were so involved in the creation process, I mean, I've actually likened, sometimes it almost felt like you would say, this is my idea, and they would say, yeah, and you would kind of break it down roughly. They would do these incredible double page spreads, but it was like they were building houses, and sometimes it felt like we almost had to build streets to connect the houses from what they actually
definitely was part of that, but it still could have been a smoother process, because I don't know. I mean, I guess in retrospect, it's hard to know if I would have done a full script. I mean, Mike Turner definitely wouldn't have followed it. Like, he would have done his own thing no matter what, to his credit. So when I wrote an outline for the first story arc, there was like 8 issues, and I think I kind of knew how I wanted it to end, the general idea, but I had no idea what to do after 8 issues. Like,
it was just a relief. You're like, oh, whew, I got through that.
Back then, I think we talked about canceling books when they sold 100,000 or whatever it was, or 75. I think 75 was the downward limit. I don't think we ever actually did it. I think we just talked about it, because by the time that happened, we saw that everything was dropping so fast that we couldn't do that. But I think maybe it's part of my nihilism or something. I don't like thinking too far ahead. So yeah, I didn't even think I was going to be on the book after 8 issues.
Wow.
So I didn't think past it, even though I set up stuff in the early issues for future storylines. I guess I was kind of like lost, right? I just basically I threw things out there, and then eventually came around to tying them up. But the first 8 issues, I was really like confident in, like I knew what I wanted. Even though as time went on, Mike had more and more say. So a lot of things that I was intending to do, he would say, no, this way's better. Usually it was. And but going back to what I was saying before, I like the whole idea of writing a plot and then doing dialogue. It's so lame. It's like I haven't really met too many writers who are very good at it. I mean, all the guys we used to work with when we followed that Marvel way, it just makes people late. Even when the art matches what you wrote in the plot. But I used to write, like with Dave Finch, I would write like page 6 through 12. This stuff happens.
Do this stuff.
I shouldn't really be
She's
surprised.
on her bike, and there's a really cool shot of her on her bike, and then
I love that the idea of really cool shot was the back shot. Like, you already know what that means.
Yeah, you already had a pretty good idea of what it was going to be.
So
but it was fun.
You kind of talked about the sales benchmark, and I think that's important for readers today, creators today, even to understand what that looked like back then versus now. I mean, 100,000 units now, particularly from an independent market or label, would be a boon. It would be a success without question. But back then, that was grounds to consider cancellation. How many units were you guys moving or expecting to move with a series like that?
When I first got there, it was like 1 million. It was 1 million was sort of like if things were selling. But then within a year, it dropped to about 400,000. Like when we did Codename Strike Force, it was basically like a year after I started. Well, and that book too, we had to resolicit it because we were so late. We sent it for comic shops to order it. Then we had to cancel that and then redo it. Wow. In between the time that we started it and then canceled it and then started it again, it went from 1 million to 400,000 or 375. I think the next time around. I think by the time we launched Witchblade, I think that was like 150 maybe. Wow. It was somewhere, maybe 172, but that was with Brad doing all sorts of increasing sales with a whole bunch of different like comic shop things. I think Tomb Raider Witchblade, I think was maybe over 200.
I know Tomb Raider #1 with all of the variant covers, we did get over 1 million again. But that was kind of a big deal by the time we got to Tomb Raider. 1 million.
Right. Yeah, 1 million was a rarity by then.
Yeah.
I'd say like by the time Witchblade came out, Witchblade was a top book when it came out. I think it was in the maybe it's number one.
Yeah.
The month that it came out. So that's right. So number one book when Witchblade came out was like maybe 170,000 copies. And that was like 1995, right? So 93, the books were selling 1 million. 94, they were selling like 500,000 or a little less. And then 95, it was down to 200 or less. And then 10 years later, it was down to 20. And now a popular book that still sells 20, right? I mean, they still sell
45, something like that.
That's still your benchmark is to get around there. Renae, just going back to the editing process, how do you end up editing, or how do you feel that you edit the Marvel way with the plots coming in and the artists coming in? I mean, David, you kind of hinted it ended up making things late, but did it frustrate you, or was it kind of like cool to see, what the artist
I
bring you?
At the time, and first of all, I have to give out a shout out to Sonia Im, because it was David Wohl and Sonia Im in the editorial department. And when we moved, I actually found the notebook that I took with me to the first coffee meeting I had with Sonia when I became an associate editor, and my notes on how to make a comic book. I'm keeping that sucker. Mm-hmm. But when I started, that was just how things were done. So I don't think it occurred to me as a new whippersnapper.
You didn't know what you didn't know, right?
I didn't know what I didn't know. So I just, that's how we do it.
It was the British guys that did it the other way. Like when Mark started sending scripts, and then his proteges would write like full scripts.
Wow.
Yep. And very specific on panel breakdowns, which was hard on our artists because they were so used to having free reign to do what they wanted to do. And so that was a little bit of a riptide there.
So I guess the real question is, when people started sending in full scripts, what was that for you? I mean, did that make your job harder just because you ended up seeing something completely different?
I mean, I think it all has pros and cons.
Right.
It definitely made it easier on the tail end if the artists were drawing what was in the panel breakdowns, because then there were no surprises with the dialogue. You didn't need to go back and realize that they missed an entire detail that we refer to here in panel 8, and it hasn't been in the scene for 2 pages. So now we have to write something to explain where this came from. So that, that made it a lot easier, I think, on the production side. But there was, like I said, definitely a time where the artists had to get used to following something so rigid. And I think it felt for them like we were taking some of their creativity away for a while.
And a lot of times writers don't know how to do it.
Right.
They're forced to do that. They don't know how to tell a story like an artist.
Right.
I was going to ask, in terms of the visual language of comics, how well versed were you at the beginning of this? I mean, obviously, David, you've got, a career already. And Renae, you're kind of jumping in from a reader standpoint, but how well were you able to communicate those things like, this is what, comics are, especially to a newcomer like Michael was?
Well, Michael was not a newcomer when I got there. By the time I got there, Michael was,
was Michael Turner.
2 months of his rise.
He was pissing David Wohl off he was pissing him off,
Yeah.
David was throwing chairs. It was terrible.
I had a theater major, so I had already studied some light theory and composition and, obviously story. So I came in with a little tiny bit of a toolbox, but because the beauty of a studio is that you're learning from other people. So Sonia Im taught me, a ton. David taught me a ton. And a lot of this is just kind of sitting there on the couch in their office, listening to conversations that are happening between Joe Benitez and David, or, Finch and Sonia. So I would just kind of absorb a lot of that.
And Mark was basically the art director.
Yeah. And I love to go sit. We had the whole coloring production bay where Richard Isanov was working, and J.D. Smith, he worked from home, but he would come in sometimes. And Peter Steigerwald was in there. So, I mean, these are juggernauts of artistic knowledge. And, or Dewey Detron, who was an inker, but I used to sit next to him while he would work, and he would just talk to me about panels, breakdowns, and why things worked. And what a wonderful opportunity to basically get an art education.
Absolutely.
Job.
Absolutely.
David, Christina Z is the co-writer on Witchblade. What was the dynamic like between the two of you guys? You said you met on AOL and you just kind of brought her in. So you know, how much was her kind of signature on the script for issue 1?
Issue 1, I think it was the plot was pretty much done by the time she started on it, but I think I was in the midst of writing issue 1 when I started talking to her, and when I like brought her in, and I would I would send her like pages as I was finishing them, like a scene, you know. I'd send it to her for like, she was sort of like my in-house editor. It was before Renae got there. We didn't even have an editor really on issue 1. I think we credited Brad Foxhoven as editor, but he didn't, because we just needed to put a name there. But she really was my editor then, because like I would send her stuff and she would just send it back to me like all crossed out and be like, you know, this sucks, you know, make this better. And I was really the first person ever in my life since my 12th grade college literature teacher did that, who told me my stuff could be better, you know? Because I think like in comics, most of the time, you're so busy trying to get it out that you don't really have time to start thinking about how could I improve this, you know, what it's done. So she totally made me think about, you know, if I'm writing something like dialogue, or I think a lot of times when I was a relatively new writer at that point. I'll write something that like reminds me of something I heard on TV and think that's okay, you know,
right.
Or some kind of like common, you know, something like people say like in pop culture, you know, like, oh, this would be a funny reference, you know, I could talk about whatever in 1995. But she pushed me past that, you know, like she basically was like, you know, this is not original. This doesn't sound right. Yeah. And I think that she improved my writing a lot. And then from that, I think I originally brought her in to be an editor, to be my like editing my script. And then she had a lot of good ideas. And then as time went on, she I think we both had different strengths. Her strengths were more in like making things interesting. She had a good concept of like pushing the envelope. That's why the combination of her and Scott Lobdell, they were two envelope pushers, and it got a little too pushed. But like when we were working together, like she just would come up with really good ideas for how the story would go. I think I was better at like tying things together and thinking about the big picture, and she'd be really good at taking individual scenes and pushing them as well as they can go. And then when it came to dialogue, you know, I like learned from Mark Grunwald at Marvel, and I was all into explaining things well and continuity and all this crap. And she was just more into making things interesting, which I think was a really good combination. And then Mike Turner basically sat in the middle of us, like her and him developed a relationship, you know, and so everything started getting pushed because she started pushing his artwork too the same way, you know. So suddenly we have like you know, torture scenes in the book where everyone's like the most memorable, like one of the most memorable scenes in the first arc of Witchblade is Nottingham with like a water, like in all black with like a water thing being shoved into his mouth, like some kind of torture that she learned from a 9 Inch Nails video. And truly. And then she's also like really into music, you know. She had like she wrote like reviews for Herb, and so it was going to like all these shows, you know, and so she was more like had her finger on the pulse of like what was big at that time. So it was a cool dynamic, you know. I think it all worked out for like at that time, it helped it like push it to where it could go. That's and awesome. We both, like Mike and I both accepted like her influence on it, knowing that it was for the better.
And as far as the evolution of the popularity of Witchblade, being one of the first in my memory that I can think of, independent titles to get a live action presentation in TV, what was that like to see, you know, something that you created and knowing its genesis to get to that level?
It was really cool when the deal came about. It was very weird because like it was TNT. This guy, Spike Selden, who ended up coming to work for our company, was like the head of programming at TNT, so he brought it in. Warner Brothers was involved, which is weird because they had a lot of their own characters, but for some reason they got involved in Witchblade.
Because they knew it was sweet, that's why.
It took a while to get made, where we were doing this like 2-hour like pilot. There's this Witchblade statue by Clay Moore that's like really popular. classic kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We used to bring that to us to pitches, and we had this pitch at TNT with Oliver Stone because he was supposed to be the original like director of it.
Wow.
He was going to be
that's
like on a TV
great.
show. It ended up being his partner Dan Halstead, who was like his producing partner, and Oliver Stone ended up needing to do other things. But he came to this one pitch meeting at TNT where we had the statue and we put it down on the table, and it was our first like big meeting to talk about the future. And then Spike Selden, the guy that championed our story, got fired from TNT, and they brought in this new woman, Julie Weiss. And she came into the room and pointed to that statue and said, "That is not what we want to do." Because it was like this simpy outfit, and she like bashed it and made fun of like the concept of it, and that was the beginning of. I mean, we had already developed it to a certain point because with Warner Brothers, and then we had TNT. So I think that's ultimately led to why it only lasted 2 seasons. Because I think she didn't really like it from the beginning. But still, it was like, I mean, I remember one of the coolest things to happen to my professional career was watching basketball on TNT and hearing Marv Albert talk about Witchblade coming on, like later on. That was like the coolest thing.
That is awesome.
So it was a great experience to be part of, and we got to give notes on the stories, and they basically loosely based the first story arc on the first comic book story arc. So it was nice to see, and they were all great people. Like we got to go up to Toronto and hang out with them and see the set. And Anthony Sestaro is a great guy who played Irons, and Eric Etabari. We're still friendly with them.
Renae, what was the pulse in the studio then when that show was hitting?
It was very positive.
Yeah, I mean, everybody was really excited about that. Truth is, for the studio, though, for a lot of us who were working on comic books, I think our life, there's a whole segment of early 2000s, late 90s that I missed all of the pop culture because we were living in the studio. Because I think we talked about this on the other podcast, but people forget that there was a time before Dropbox.
Right.
And when things actually had to be physically scanned in and put on a disc and then driven from place to place. So when things done the Marvel way would push until the night before it had to go to press, then somebody had to get in their car and drive around Los Angeles to pick up inks, to bring them to the studio, to be scanned, to bring the disc over to somebody's house to color, take the disc of the ones they had colored, bring it back, load those in. It was quite a process, and there were many, many Tuesdays to Thursdays, or it started off Wednesdays to Fridays that you just would not go home. You would just live in the studio and then get the film made and do the parking brake into, FedEx at the airport and put it on the plane and hope you made press. We were sort of aware of the world, but I think a lot of it was kind of like, yeah, there's stuff happening out there, but we're just deadlining all the time. But when Witchblade came out, that was really amazing. And actually, it was the pilot of Witchblade in Chicago. That is when I met my husband.
Oh, at a movie theater?
I showed up at the hotel. Mark Silvestri came down and said, "Hey, Renae, here's the car. We're going to the pilot." So I jumped in the car and we went and watched Witchblade on a big screen, which was, that's crazy to see something that you've been working on all the details of, and then to see somebody do a version of it on the big screen is pretty amazing. And then after that, I was feeling, like I said, I was feeling pretty snarky. So I talked to the big tall guy at the bar.
It worked, obviously. I mean,
Don't you know who I am? I'm the editor for that thing that's now on big screen. Anyway, so that was, but it was so wonderful. We used to have parties at Michael Turner's house and Mark's house sometimes for the Witchblade showings. So we would all get together and we would all hang out and watch it when it came on. So it was pretty great.
Yeah, it's funny too, and again, just kind of harkening back to that, I wonder. I mean, obviously, let's not even go COVID, right? Let's go pre-COVID, because it's become such a digital world. It's become such a distance. Everything is kind of done. Now Zoom has now become like the place to conference. You don't even need to be in the same room. But there's something about that again, and I'm just likening it back to the Wizard days when there was a bullpen and we used to hang out and play video games after, or play ping pong, or we had a basketball court, basketball hoop in the parking lot. I mean, there's something about that you know, I feel like I definitely feel like old man on the lawn right now. But you know, there's you
Well,
know,
it was the advent of that too, because we
Yeah.
had message boards. People, do you
Yeah.
remember that? Message boards?
we're living in a message board world right now.
Yeah. But it was kind of the start of that. And so people would go to the message boards and have contact with the creators and people who were working at the studio. We had a ping pong table and a foosball table and a pool table. And over the ping pong table, there was a camera. And so you could watch the camera. It was like reality TV.
Wow.
Before reality TV, you could watch the camera, and people would come on the message boards and say, "Hey, I'm watching the ping pong table," and we would go wave or play. But that was like that. You know, now that's like not a big deal, but back in the day, that was a really big deal.
Y'all were pioneering only fan accounts with ping pong. That's
Oh man, there were some rivalries. There were people who wouldn't. Was it Brad Foxhoven? Billy Tan was the champion. Billy Tan could beat anyone in ping pong. Brad beat him one time and then refused to play him again.
I would do the same thing.
And it drove Billy insane. He used to go into Brad's office and put the paddle down on the desk, and Brad was like, "Nope, I won." And that was a thing.
That's amazing.
That was smart actually. So I mean, at this point, you can't go wrong. David, final question. In the pantheon now, I mean, you've spanned so many companies now, Marvel, you know, Top Cow, and then now you're at Valiant right now too, which congratulations. You know, you're actually with again former Wizard, you know, publisher Fred Pierce. We've had Lisa Hawkins on our Rogue Wave show before too, who's awesome
cool.
as well too. Where do you put Witchblade #1 in your personal wall? You know, is it up there? Are you hanging it up there? Are you proud of it? Are you?
It's pretty much it's definitely in the top 3 of my personal wall.
What's beside it?
What's the rest?
That? Yeah.
Executive Assistant Iris that I created at Aspen. You know, I'm really proud of that.
Great series.
I'm leaving the third one open. Maybe my kids. Is that the word?
No. The kids don't count here. Kids don't count. No. I've been stuck home with my kids for 6. So is Victor. We're good. We're good.
Comics over kiddos.
I appreciate that.
It was such an experience. You know, it was like Renae was saying earlier. It was that, like, I wish I could go back and experience it with what I know now. You know, with like where I know life goes.
Yeah.
I would have coddled it more. You know, I would have. I probably would have slapped myself down, you know, quicker when I was jealous of Mike Turner's success. And because like, you know, like those moments, like I'll never forget them. You know, they were just really fun. And
Right.
and I'm eternally thankful to Mark Silvestri for you know, giving us that incubator. You know, giving us the time to just work on something until it was the best it could be. You know, I mean. Like another thing, I mean, who would ever think we could do that anymore? You know, I mean,
Right.
maybe Pixar is the only company that still works like that.
Sure.
But it was amazing. You know, we talked about our lightning in a bottle.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, folks. This is another edition of Wednesday Forever. I want to thank David and Renae for jumping on, talking about Witchblade #1. Go and obviously subscribe to us. We're on all the major podcasting apps, and go to the YouTube channel for Rogue Matter. YouTube.com/Rogue Matter, and subscribe to us, and you'll get more great content like this. Guys, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolute
Thank
pleasure.
you.
We'll do it again soon. This has been Wednesday Forever.